Perfect. Thank you, Laura. Can you hear me okay? All set up still?
Yes, you're all good.
Perfect. Awesome. So hi, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to our presentation. Like Laura said, I'm Elizabeth Nelson, and I'm at Penn State University's Lehigh Valley campus, which, for those of you who aren't familiar with Pennsylvania, it's near Allentown for any Billy Joel fans, and it's about an hour northwest of Philadelphia for everybody else. Angela, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, so I'm Angela, and I am at the Penn State Behrend campus, which is up in the northwest corner of the state. We're right on Lake Erie. So Elizabeth and I are kind of on opposite ends of the state from each other.
Definitely. So we're here to share with you the results of our research looking at the experiences, perceptions, and support needs of academic librarians who are teaching for-credit courses in addition to their regular work as librarians. In today's presentation, we're going to give you some background on our project. We'll go over the results that we got from our survey questions. We'll talk a bit about the themes that we're seeing as we're starting to work on analyzing our focus group discussions, as well as those survey results. We have a lot to cover in a relatively short time, so we are planning on time for Q&A at the end of the session, but we also want to invite everybody to please post your questions and thoughts in the chat as we talk as well, and we'll address what we can as we go. One other note before we start. Our slides are quite text heavy, and we know that's not particularly popular, but we designed them that way deliberately to make them more useful for you or others who might have missed today's session, so that anyone can review them after the fact and really get most of what we were trying to say. We're not going to read everything on the slides for that reason, but we do invite you all to revisit them and also to reach out to us as needed for more information and context. So let's start with a little background context on how we got here. Angela and I were both on the Penn State Library's Curricular and Instructional Affairs Committee, which we call CIA, which is primarily focused on supporting librarians who teach for-credit courses throughout our campuses. Currently, Penn State librarians that do participate in for-credit instruction are few and far between, despite the interest that we see expressed by our colleagues. And we really wanted to know more about why that was happening and what we could do to help expand those for-credit instruction offerings. We learned some really interesting things from our internal survey and the small group meetings that we had with our peers. Let me just mute that sound real quick. Okay. Let me get back to my notes. Yes. Oh, and we also wanted to talk to them a lot about the kinds of hoops that librarians have to jump through and the value that they see in their instruction despite those challenges when they're able to do it. And it really inspired us to see from those internal discussions what the experience for librarians at other institutions teaching for credit was like or in comparison to our own. So we developed a survey which was declared exempt from IRB, probably because it was fully anonymous. We didn't ask about any sensitive topics, and anything we did have like demographic questions were skippable and were hopefully very thoughtfully worded. We distributed the survey to several ACRL listservs in order to make sure that we were really targeting academic librarians, at least for this version. At the end of the survey, we allowed our participants to self-select if they wanted to participate in a follow-up discussion. Again, we were really focused on privacy, so we let them decide if they wanted to have a small focus group setting or if they would be more comfortable with just a one-on-one private individual interview with us, or I guess one-on-two. Those interviews and focus groups took place after we closed our survey. We scheduled them all, some of them, or all of them actually, via some gloriously color-coded spreadsheets and a lot of emails. And we started with our interviews from late February through early March and ended with our focus groups in March. Fun fact, we managed to set it up so that most of our focus groups actually fell during our spring break week. So Angela and I conducted 5 of these focus groups in just 1 week in March, 1 per day. And that actually made it easier for us to kind of detect and discuss themes that we were seeing arising from those conversations in real time rather than just after the fact. So on our next slide, I think perfect. Our survey distribution went out just at the end of fall semester with the winter holidays looming. Despite this, we were shocked and excited to see the number of responses that we received, especially when we were targeting such a specific pool of not just academic librarians, but academic librarians who have served or are serving as instructors of record for for-credit courses. We were also thrilled at the response we got to our request for follow-up discussions. So many librarians volunteered, worked through all of our many scheduling emails, and took time to sit down and speak with us for an hour. We obviously can't name names, but they know who they are, and we thank them for their engagement, their time, and their thoughtful responses, as we also thank our survey respondents. So one last thing before we get into our actual survey results, our demographics. 60% of our respondents were at doctoral granting universities or institutions, and a further 34% were at four-year non-doctoral institutions. So overall, 94% of our respondents were at four-year institutions in general. While we didn't ask about the size of the institution in terms of either student enrollment or numbers of library staff, we feel like this might be an indication that four-year institutions of various sizes might provide more opportunities for additional credit courses to be offered and then taught by librarians. Or it could mean that institutions that have graduate programs, either doctoral or master's, have more of an opportunity for librarians to teach those upper-level research-focused for-credit courses. Or these type of institutions may just have a more robust system in place to allow for for-credit instruction by folks other than teaching faculty. As you'll see later, the forms that our respondents' for-credit instruction took varied greatly across institutions, so it's really hard to draw any specific conclusions from this. It's not presented in these graphics, but 98% of our respondents reported that they were employed in a full-time capacity. But here you can see that most of the respondents, about 79%, hold some sort of faculty position. 56% are tenure or tenure track. So this is an indication we think that those types of roles or status might be a factor in the ability to teach for credit at some institutions. It could be dependent on the institution. Maybe only people with faculty status can teach for credit, or it could mean that people who have faculty status or are on the tenure track or are tenured are feeling more empowered to pursue additional and somewhat unusual work. And then finally, we can see that respondents have been working as a librarian on average for more than 10 years, with 74% having more than 8 years of experience. This seems to indicate that teaching for credit is something that most librarians pursue or are only able to pursue once they're past the early years of their careers. However, we did speak to several librarians who were hired into roles that specifically prioritize for-credit instruction as a core responsibility. So future research on how or if librarians feel like they're being prepared to teach for credit in their degree programs or in their early career positions might be a really interesting addition to this conversation. So now I am going to hand it off to Angela to take us through some of what we feel are the most interesting survey results. Angela.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So for the first part of the survey, this was a multiple choice portion. We asked about the types of for-credit instruction that was being done. And I might go through these a little fast, so be sure to put questions into the chat there. So as you can see here on this first question there, the vast majority of for-credit instructions that librarians teach is at the undergraduate level, with 84% of for-credit instruction taking place at this undergraduate level. You can see that other 14% is graduate, and the 2% other included things like associates, or there was some that indicated a consortial undergraduate program across several institutions. Now, again, I think it would be interesting to correlate if the vast majority of any instruction by librarians is happening at the undergraduate level. This has been my own experience, but that's not something that we really have in this survey here. But it also might be able to tell us some things about, do we as librarians feel that we are only qualified to teach at the undergraduate level, or is that what our institutions feel we're qualified to teach? So the next graph there, additionally, we can see that there are 50% of the librarians who were teaching only 1 to 2 sections per academic year. And in our focus groups, we were able to tease out a little bit more information about this. We found that most librarians teach only 1 course per semester. The other, you can see how it's kind of declining there, the more sections we get. So we had about 23% that did about 3 to 5 sections per academic year. And again, this could say something about the capacity issues for librarians to take on for-credit instruction on top of all the other things that they're responsible for. And we'll get a little more into this when we go into the focus groups. We delve into that a little more. Now, while we did not ask this, there also might be some specific institutional limitations based on who and how much individuals can teach that may be reflected in these results here. Next questions here, we are interested in if these courses that librarians are teaching are required or elective. And quite honestly, we were a little surprised that there was almost an even split between required and elective. It could be that some institutions are better at tying their courses to the curriculum, or that librarians are asked or allowed to teach required classes. We also noticed that some of these required classes were things like first year seminar or first year experience, and these are often required of all first year students. And in some cases, the institutions specifically make non-teaching faculty the instructor of record here. So those include things like advisors, resident staff, or librarians, of course. And while we don't really know this for sure, it might say something about how the librarian is just seen as another warm body to be in those classes during staffing shortages. The next graph you can see there is asked how long librarians have been teaching. And you can see here at most, at 34%, most of them have taught for 3 to 5 years. And if you remember back from the demographic slide there, the majority of participants have an average of 10 plus years of experience. So again, this is a little further indication to us that most librarians do not start with no experience as ForCredit instructors. So this might mean that it is a mid-career activity for librarians in general. So in the next part of our survey here, we are interested in how this ForCredit instruction is or is not connected to the respondent's role as a librarian, and what policies might exist around this. So the policy question was we were greatly interested in that, because as Penn State, we have policies about how to use policies, and we wanted to know about how other institutions handle this before we do internal work to make more policies for us. So as you can see here, we asked them about if anyone in their current role would be expected to teach ForCredit. So such as if they left the position, would the replacement be expected to teach those ForCredit courses? Now, over half of them, 63%, said it is not part of their position. Okay. So that was a lot for us. The other 33% there said that it was part of their job duties and tied to their position. And in some cases, this teaching ForCredit was tied to requirements for promotion and or tenure. And to be honest, this 33% was a lot higher than I was expected. And as Elizabeth mentioned earlier, this might be something we'll look into for future research on degree programs for librarians. And you can see in the second graph there, this is the one about policies. And now you all might have guessed this, but we were kind of shocked to learn that 69% of respondents did not have specific policies at their library about what, how, or when a librarian participates in ForCredit instruction. Now, we learned that most of them have to follow university guidelines. And there was some notes about how this works to some degree or not, because librarians are, a little different than teaching faculty and how things work that way. So moving on, the next section of our survey looks into what the motivations for teaching ForCredit were. And you can see here that these motivations were almost evenly distributed across the various categories we have here. And we allowed our respondents here to choose as many of these that applied to them as they wanted. Now, at the most here, at 18%, they selected that they were motivated to do ForCredit instruction, was to have a more consistent long-term contact with students. And a close 17% was to get experience teaching a full course or being an instructor of record. Now, the remainder of those categories there all ranged between 11 to 15%, so they were all very close to each other. Now, at the bottom there, you can kind of see there was, this is where we had 6% of respondents indicated other reasons that they were motivated to teach. And we, Elizabeth and I separated them down a little further to include things like they were motivated to get additional financial compensation, use their expertise in another subject area, to fill a need at their institution, or some of them just really indicated they were very, very passionate about teaching. So as you can kind of see here, this motivation for teaching ForCredit is really personal and institution dependent. Now, this next question asked if they felt if their motivation was met while they were teaching these ForCredit courses. And you can see there that this result here is very similar to the previous slide. I'll just flip back to a minute here. So that we can see that their motivations were almost exactly met by their teaching activities. And this last portion of the survey, the multiple choice portion of the survey, asks them to rate their experiences teaching ForCredit. And as you can see, all of them indicated that they had a positive experience, so a 5 to 10 rating here. And with the majority of them having a rating of 8, that was 37% of respondents. And then we had 23%, so almost a full quarter of them rated it as a 10. So again, this really indicates to us that those that do ForCredit teaching find it to be an excellent experience. So next, the survey asks some open-ended questions on impact to the individual in their library, the recognition and support they kind of got for that. And Elizabeth is going to take us through those.
Oh, I have to unmute first. All right, perfect. Thank you, Angela. So on each of these slides, we're going to share the big themes that we saw in the open text responses to these questions, and then some selected quotes that we think will help illustrate these themes or that are just worth noting. Again, we're not going to read everything that's on the slide, but we invite you to save the slides. We'll share the link to them at the end of the presentation so you can go through at your leisure. So first, we asked about how teaching ForCredit impacted their overall work as a librarian. Many of our respondents noted that their teaching increased their own job satisfaction, motivation, and engagement with librarianship. They also felt that it demonstrated the value of the library, helped them build connections across the institution with faculty, staff, and students, and increased student and faculty engagement with and understanding of the role and services of the library on campus. Some respondents also noted that teaching ForCredit helped to improve their instruction skills in all aspects, from for their ForCredit courses to one-shots to any kind of instruction that they were participating in. While there were many positives, 43 of our 72 responses, so about 60%, to this question noted that teaching ForCredit had led to increased workload and or stress. One of the respondents summed this up well by saying, yes, it is extra work, but it is a wonderful addition to my job and energizing. So we were also interested in learning how teaching ForCredit had an impact on not just them, but their library as a whole. Just like in our previous question, respondents noted that their teaching helped to demonstrate the value of the library and better integrate the librarians and the library as a partner to the rest of the campus. In fact, many of our respondents just said, as I said in the previous question, or see my previous response. However, it also created some pressures on the library, such as the instructor librarians were not always able to equitably share in supporting library services, participating in library-wide projects, et cetera, because of the time and effort they had to spend on their teaching. Overall, about twice as many responses focused on positive impacts to the library as on negative impacts. And interestingly, 19 of those 70, so 29%, reported that there was no impact on the library, or at least no impact that they were aware of, from the time and effort that they were spending teaching ForCredit courses. It may be helpful to note here something that we'll also see in the focus groups. It was not uncommon, and I saw a question come up similar to this in the chat. It wasn't uncommon for our respondents to be working full-time as librarians and also teaching as adjuncts on the side in the same or even in different institutions. So in those cases where their teaching work is what we were calling out of load, outside of their librarian responsibilities, their instruction work might be, and sometimes has to be, held completely separate and assessed separately from their librarian job responsibilities. So the next question asked respondents to focus on how their ForCredit instruction impacted their whole campus or their institution, again, to the best of their ability to judge that. There were many responses that focused on how it helped to integrate the library as a campus partner and raise the value of librarians on campus. One respondent stated, teaching ForCredit courses has helped change perceptions of the librarians as educators and not simply service providers. There was also a focus on what students gain from librarians teaching ForCredit courses, mostly greater and more thorough exposure to information literacy skills. Several respondents had been part of assessments of their courses that enabled them to show that students who took their courses, particularly information literacy focused general education courses or first year experience courses, that those students had higher retention rates than students who had not taken their courses. But of course, not all of our respondents are teaching courses that are being assessed in this way by their institutions. Respondents also told us that teaching these courses was generally beneficial to the library because it increased the librarian's knowledge of important elements of campus life that were happening without involvement from the library. So the library and librarians are often siloed away from things like learning how to use the learning management system, participating in the processes of approving or assessing courses through things like curriculum committees, or even just day-to-day things like what it's like to deal with grading students or interacting with students as their professor. So being an instructor of record allowed these librarians to raise the profile of librarians on campus as educators, rather than just lovely book hoarding knowledge keepers, as well as bring the knowledge of these other pieces of campus life back to their library colleagues and to library decision-making around things like course reserves, collection development, student and faculty outreach, faculty professional development, and more. And then the final open text question asked about how these instructor librarians perceived the support, recognition, and/or compensation that they did or did not receive for this work. We're going to leave compensation and its thorns to the side for the moment, and just talk for a second about the support and recognition piece. It was really fascinating to see that respondents were almost evenly split between feeling that they either had or had not received adequate support and recognition for their work. There are some nuances that are going to need to be teased out about how those who felt adequately supported but not recognized, and vice versa. We didn't define these terms in detail, and it was clear from the responses that what one person might classify as support, another person would see as overbearing supervision. Some respondents felt that they were supported but not recognized, and vice versa. So it would be really interesting to dive deeper into what kinds of approaches we feel or they feel are good or bad for each category, for support and for recognition. But respondents who noted that they did not feel adequately supported or recognized were also much more likely to mention the idea of burnout in their responses. So this is something we really want to be aware of for librarians who are doing this kind of work. It's also interesting to note that those that felt they were adequately compensated for their work also felt supported and recognized. However, twice as many respondents felt that they are or were not being adequately compensated for their teaching work. Some noted that this is a problem across the board, not just for librarians, citing low pay for adjuncts and for most faculty at institutions across the US. However, one of our focus group participants told us that completing this portion of the survey had led them to investigate pay for librarian instructors, and they discovered that librarians at their institution who were teaching as adjuncts were being paid significantly less than any other faculty adjuncts for the same work. So we wanted to just encourage anybody who's doing this kind of work to use those connections that you're building across the campus and learn more about your status and how you measure up in terms of things like compensation and support throughout the larger organization if you haven't done that already. So now we're going to move on to discussing the themes and ideas that came out of our focus group and interview discussions, and I will hand it back to Angela to get us started.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So there are some things to note before we discuss the results of the interview and focus groups. And I might refer to these collectively as discussions. The one thing to remember, I believe we said this in the beginning, but respondents self-selected to participate in these discussions after they completed the survey. So this means that they had strong motivation to discuss ForCredit instruction. We also made sure to ensure that the privacy of the respondents, we also made sure to ensure the privacy of these respondents, which means that they were free to discuss their specific situations, institutions, or not. But what this does mean is that this data is not generalizable. Respondents were from a wide variety of institutions, from specialized upper level institutions to community colleges to R1 research institutes. Additionally, as we mentioned before, most of these participants had faculty or faculty-like employment status, but we did have a few participants that were staff. And we had asked participants some overarching questions, and these will be included in the link we're going to share at the end to all of our shared materials with the slides. So while we had some overarching questions here, we did allow them to direct the conversation. So what we are presenting here are some of the major themes that came out of the discussion. So these are some of the themes that came out, and you'll notice that they focus on assessment, compensation, how teaching ForCredit affected the librarian's other duties, and what values were perceived in teaching ForCredit. Next, we're going to dive into some of these themes in a little more detail and share some of the thoughts that participants shared with us. Mentioned before, we really were focused on privacy and all of those concerns, which means that we're going to share some quotes and some other things that participants shared with us, but these have been paraphrased or anonymized, mostly because Elizabeth and I, our data collection for these discussions were notes we took by ourselves, so we do realize that these are not direct quotes. All right, so one of the first themes that came out is how does ForCredit instructions by librarians work at their institution? And we also wanted to focus in on how these were assessed. So the majority of courses that librarians teach ForCredit are designated as general education or those first-year seminar experience courses. Now, this may be an indication that information literacy courses are not as well integrated into disciplinary curriculum, or that those specific institutions are looking for anyone qualified to teach these introductory courses. Also, most librarians do not have a formalized assessment for their ForCredit teaching activities through their library. They rely on institutional methods such as student feedback, data reporting to different officers on campus, and some of them did mention things like they had some peer observations of their teaching through things like their teaching center. Now, the most common form of assessment is through the student evaluations at the end of the course. And there was also a note there that while some participants mentioned that more assessment would be desirable, we suspect that this lack of assessment is widespread throughout academia. Now, the majority of these courses were not required as part of a degree program. So students did not have to take this specific course that the librarian was teaching to graduate. These were often offered as an option among similar types of courses. So, for example, students needed to have so many general education credits, and they could take this course offered by the librarian. So finally, we believe that since most of our participants held captain status, they were able to propose new ForCredit courses using the same process as any other faculty at their institution. Now, in most cases, we found that the courses librarians proposed were focused on information literacy. And for librarians that were teaching ForCredit in another discipline or something like those first-year experience courses, they often adopted or modified the course that someone else has created. I know that's a lot, but on this slide here, you can see that there are some thoughts from our participants related to this theme. And you can see that most of them really discuss the need for these librarian-led ForCredit courses to really be tied to the requirements for the student to make it a worthwhile endeavor for the librarian and for the students. Our next theme here centers around compensation, workload accommodations, and the support that our participants may or may not be receiving. Now, the majority of participants notice that the work that they do for credit courses is considered part of their job duties, and that they were also treated as adjunct instructors and paid at an adjunct rate for this work. So this is like I always get a little confused trying to tease this out. So I'll try to make it easier for you to follow. So as we know with most things in academia here, there's a mixture of what these scenarios are, where some librarians have ForCredit instruction built directly into their librarian position with no additional compensation, while others teach ForCredit and get paid separately, but must do all of this ForCredit work outside library hours. And some have this part of their position, but they're also getting paid in extra, adjunct pay or load, kind of overload pay in that way. So we definitely have to tease some more of that out as we continue on here. Now, the other thing that participants discussed was the type of workload adjustments that they might receive. So in general, these adjustments to their work was dependent on the individual negotiating with their supervisor and or their library colleagues. And what this most often resulted in is the librarian instructor participating less in other library services like lesson staffing or one-shot instruction sessions. Related to this, the support that these librarians received to teach ForCredit courses varied widely based on institution or their supervisor, and some even mentioned a change in support of this with a change in their supervisor. And nearly all of them that experienced it mentioned how helpful it was to have a peer or a mentor when they began teaching, because almost none of them had formal training from their institution on how to teach ForCredit. And we really suspect that this is similar in all higher education institutions. And while most of them reported that they did not have this formal training, they all just said things about participating in professional development around pedagogy, often through their institution's teaching center, to improve their skills around teaching due to this lack of formal training. So this slide here has some thoughts from our participants about this themes that came up. As you can see here, most of them focused on the need to have that support and accommodations to be able to successfully teach ForCredit courses. And now I'm going to hand it back to Elizabeth, who's going to take us through the remainder here.
Perfect. Thank you, Angela. So the next theme focused on the impact of teaching ForCredit instruction on the library. Like Angela mentioned earlier, we went into this thinking that we would learn a lot about the policies that other librarians have around this ForCredit work, but it turns out that Penn State is perhaps the most policy-happy library of the bunch, to the point that we are actually pretty extreme outliers in the conversation. Almost no participants had any policies through their library that guide how or when they teach ForCredit library courses. Most mentioned that they have to follow the same policies for teaching faculty at the institution level, though, so they're usually just using the general faculty handbook. Some mentioned that having policies would be helpful, especially to provide guidance on workload, but others mentioned that not having policies allowed them to have much more flexibility in teaching, since librarians don't often match the criteria of other faculty. We also asked where this ForCredit instruction fell in the overall priorities of the library. As mentioned on the previous slide, if librarians received workload adjustments, that usually still meant that their other work fell onto other library workers, which in some situations was causing overburdening or siloing, or overburdening of library staff and faculty and siloing of the instructor librarians. Some mentioned that while teaching ForCredit does add extra work and can add to your risk for burnout, it also brought more awareness of faculty and student needs to their other library duties. For example, they were able to purchase materials from the collection that they know students will use instead of just guessing or relying on information being reported by other faculty. Finally, most of the participants noted that there were several perks to being a ForCredit instructor. It made them more aware of the experiences of teaching faculty, students, and the institution as a whole. This helped them feel better connected to their users and helped them build better relationships. In turn, they all noted that being a ForCredit instructor led to an increase in the library's profile and value across the institution and helped them and other librarians be viewed as experts and peers in the eyes of the general faculty, something that most of them had not experienced before teaching. So on the next slide, you'll see some of the quotes and paraphrases that we wanted to share from this area of our discussion. And I really like the last of the sort of true word-for-word quotes, which are the ones you see in quotes, which says that the participants' library was used to seeing teaching ForCredit as a way to lose FTE from among their pool of librarians, so not a great thing, but now they're seeing it as a way for the library to add more value to the university as a whole. So then the final theme that we want to discuss, although there is still a lot more information for us to mine out of these conversations, centers on how valuable the participants felt ForCredit instruction by librarians was or could be. Unsurprisingly, given the amount of time and energy our participants had invested in helping us answer these questions, many of them felt that ForCredit instruction by librarians can be incredibly valuable, sometimes even more valuable than other forms of instruction and outreach. However, many of them also emphasized that all types of instruction that librarians do are valuable, and we should consider this to be just another tool in the toolbox that we can draw from to work with different contexts and different user needs. Participants, however, were adamant that to be successful with ForCredit instruction, librarians need to be willing to teach, passionate about teaching, and have adequate support to be good teachers. There was consensus that not everyone is cut out to do this kind of work, but also that not everyone wants to do this kind of work, and that we absolutely should not be steering in a direction as a profession that would start to expect for-credit instruction from all librarians if we want to maintain the value of the diverse aspects of our jobs. Participants also believed that their library-led for-credit courses brought significant value to students, both in how it was making the library more aware and responsive to student needs, and in how students' understanding of information literacy skills and critical thinking were being improved. Most also found that librarians teaching for credit enhanced the perceptions of the librarians and the library at their institution by putting them on a more even footing with the teaching faculty and providing them with a better understanding of how the institution operates outside library-related processes. So again, here are some of the quotes and paraphrases for you to review later that express some of the themes that we just discussed. So then, in conclusion, we found that most librarians were taking on for-credit instruction outside of their library duties. Most of them are teaching 1 to 2 for-credit courses a year as an elective at the undergrad level. There are, of course, examples that don't fit that, but that was the majority. Those courses, those undergrad electives, are often general education courses or first-year experience courses. Again, not always, but that does seem to be a very common pathway. Motivations to teach are often personal, but it does mean that the work of teaching is often worthwhile and sometimes even uplifting to the librarian doing the teaching, despite the energy and time that's involved with doing this well. For many of our participants, as we've said a couple times, teaching led to an increase in job satisfaction, helped them to create better connections across the institution, and made them feel that they were personally increasing the library's value on campus. However, only people who are passionate about it should be in positions where they're teaching for credit. And even then, even with passion, a lack of adequate support, recognition, and compensation can still cause great stress and increase their potential for burnout. So in summary, our results tell us that those who do this work feel that teaching for credit is valuable, worth exploring, and worth the work for the librarians who want to pursue it and who are adequately supported in pursuing it. Just to quickly note, as we mentioned at the beginning, our next step with this research is to publish an article with our full results, hopefully this summer. The plan is to publish in a fully open access journal so everyone can read the thoughts that our participants so generously shared with us. Internally, we're also hoping to take all of this knowledge that we gained back to stakeholders within our own for-credit instruction program to analyze, improve, and hopefully re-energize that work at our university. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. So we left a significant amount of time for Q&A, hoping that there would be quite a lot of questions, and there have been some great questions coming in through the chat. So I just want to take a quick second to thank you all so much for coming and remind everybody you can unmute to ask questions. If you want to do that, please raise your hand. We'll look back through the chat and see there are some questions that we tried to answer quickly, but we probably want to go back to those in more detail. Oh, and also let me get the link to our folder, which has today's slides, and it also has our survey questions and our focus group questions, in case that's helpful. So thank you all so much.
Elizabeth and Angela, thank you so much for presenting your research to us today. I think that most of the questions in the chat have been answered, but Amy just added one. What do you think is important about your policies regarding librarians teaching, and are your policies available online?
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't think our policies they're on our intranet, so I don't think they're public facing. I think one of the more helpful things maybe for our policies is the function of the CIA committee in reviewing proposals from librarians who want to teach courses, and then also every year reviewing the materials for the librarians who are teaching those courses, kind of because we're such a large university, to make sure that a course that's being offered at multiple campuses will still kind of meet the same criteria, the same way any departmental committee would do that. Angela, do you have any other?
Yeah, I think that some of the reasons maybe Penn State is policy happy is that it really helps us in the library with the logistics of how to teach, right? So who do we contact to teach this type of thing? How do we get paid? How does that all work? And that's where policies can help us out there. So we'll see.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. And I do encourage anyone, if you want to hop on your mics and ask questions, we encourage that. And we do have another question in the chat from Elena. While you mentioned wanting to write an article, do you have any desires or plans on collecting additional data? And while you have such great info, you may not feel it's necessary.
I'll jump in here. I don't know.
Let's see if that's better. If you can hear me better. So one of the things that we've thought about, we don't at the moment have any clear ideas about collecting more data. One of the things Elizabeth and I had just tossed around recently was like, we talked to all of the folks that are very interested in ForCredit instruction. It might be interesting to see those folks that say, oh no, I would never teach ForCredit. So we don't have any of that data, but I think most of you realize that's a whole other project, so we'll see what happens. I don't know if you had anything else with this.
I don't know that we can collect it now because our survey was anonymous, but now I wish we had asked, there was a question in the chat asking if most of these courses were online or in person, and that we didn't ask about modality in our survey of like how they were teaching. I don't think we did anyway. I still have a little bit of brain fog, so I may not be remembering correctly, but that would be really interesting to see, because I know from a lot of our responses in the focus groups and in the open text responses and in the interviews, we had people saying that they were teaching all different kinds of courses, and the modality really kind of, we definitely heard from people who are like, oh, it's online asynchronous, so it's kind of a check the box course and students don't really engage with it, but it does help them. And then people saying it's in person and it's such a great opportunity to connect, and kind of vice versa of like, oh, it's online, so I get to talk to students from all over the world. And so there were really varied experiences, but it was also interesting. I don't think we mentioned this in our slides, but a number of different people said that one of the ways that they felt this brought value to the institution was increasing the curricular offerings of the institution, that the librarians could offer a course that would allow a particular like major to add a track, or that would help them improve something, or that would even just practically give students a way to take those last 3 credits that they need in a way that's going to be useful for them and that they're going to see the value in. So that modality piece might be really interesting too, to think about digital divide kinds of things, international student kinds of concerns of like, well, what courses are available, and is this something that could fill some of those gaps?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know for me at my institution at Bowling Green State University, we teach a 1-hour credit bearing course, and it is designed to fill that gap of there are not that many 1-hour courses at the institution, and there are a lot of students that need 1 credit hour to graduate. So we get a lot of seniors, but our course is designed as an intro to college research course. So our course does not necessarily match with the students that are taking it. So we really want to create another 1 credit hour that is more designed for maybe like a career InfoLit or something else that these students would get more value out of, because our population does not match with the course. So we want to do something else. So we have another question from Brittany. Did you see if folks were teaching courses that were, quote, owned by the library, or were they teaching courses that had homes in other departments, like a first-year course or within an SLIS department?
So sorry.
No, you go ahead. Go ahead.
Thanks. We sort of have some of this data. We didn't explicitly ask this. I think it came out in our focus group discussions, et cetera. But there was a mix of this. And it's really dependent, I think, on the institution. So either some folks have this set up that the library owns those courses, or sometimes they have to go out and get it through a different department. I think at Penn State here, ours have to go through the liberal arts college. So it's really a mix, but I do agree that's something we should probably look into further. That is also one of the questions we had internally, was can the library become the home for our classes, or why do we have to take it through another department? And we definitely think this is similar at other institutions.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, you want to add some?
No, yeah, I'll just add that it also varied depending on how the person was doing their instruction. That we had librarians who were teaching information literacy courses, either as part of their job description or because they were asked to do so by the university. And so they were kind of doing that as an adjunct, but it was all heavily tied to the library. And then we did also have a number of librarians who were teaching history courses or psychology courses or things that were not directly connected to the library. And some of those courses weren't like, research methods in psychology or something. They were straight up, content level kinds of courses. And so in those cases, they were working as adjuncts really separately from their librarian duties. And they're still seeing those impacts and benefits that we talked about just from their personal experiences. But yeah, the home for those courses becomes kind of weird. And we did talk to at least one person who said, actually several people who were requested, like a department came to them and said, would you teach this course in our department? But you can kind of do what you want with it. And so they could add in information literacy components. Same thing with the first year courses and gen ed courses. They could often kind of add in some information literacy or make it a little bit more explicit. But yeah, it really varies across the spectrum there.
Yeah, and I think this is a related question from Jesse. So were many librarians owners of their curriculum, or was it not their IP or their teaching materials then?
Yeah, that was something that almost all of our focus group participants, et cetera, were very clear about, was that they valued their academic freedom. Like some of them mentioned things like, well, they were given like a basic outline in the course, or they had to make specific like goals or outcomes for first year seminar things. Within that course, they were able to modify or create their own curriculum, their own assignments, whatever they wanted, as long as they met those bigger goals for the university. I do remember one participant we spoke to, I think it might have been an interview. They were very, very possessive of their materials that they created. And they said things like they were like, if they left this position, they don't know if they would leave those materials behind because they felt ownership over it. So I think all of them did say that, they have ownership over their own coursework and stuff.
Yeah, I think the only ones who might not are the ones who are teaching one section of the common campus FYE or something like that, where they really can't modify the materials too much, but even then they could usually kind of give more emphasis to some things than others. And I think, Angela, I may have missed this if you mentioned it, but the folks who were team teaching said that it was incredibly helpful to have a team of other librarians to work with. And when they were not the only librarian teaching courses, or when there was a department of librarians teaching courses, they were generally openly sharing everything. We actually talked to a couple who had produced an OER, or like an openly licensed textbook for their course and shared it out on the internet, or were modifying materials and using them. And so, yeah, there's usually, when there's a group, there tends to be a lot more openness involved. And I think from Elena's follow-up of folks who are teaching outside the library are credentialed by other departments, I think that's right. I think most of them did mention that if they were teaching something in another department, they had some kind of expertise in that area. I don't know if it was as formal as they have a master's or a PhD, or if they could just kind of show, I have the expertise here. But some of that did also depend on institutions. We talked to some institutions where there is no faculty status. We talked to some institutions where everybody has faculty status. It was really how people get picked to teach also seems to depend a little bit on how big and how formal the institution is. If it's a small, everybody's working multiple jobs kind of to keep everything running sort of institution, it's not uncommon for them to say, well, do you know enough about this? Okay, cool. You don't necessarily need a formal background in this, but if you can show that you know the material. So that also varied.